Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's program. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and protecting the historic built environment of Washington, DC since 1971. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite public programs like this one today. They are Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Bayer Blinder Bell, EHT Traceries, KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to historic preservation in Washington, DC. Additionally, this program is brought to you in collaboration with the Washington chapter of the American Institute of Architects, or AIADC, the Washington Architectural Foundation, and the District Architecture Center. We greatly appreciate their partnership, and I will drop their website links into the chat momentarily so you can learn more about them. And before the presentation begins, I just want to share a few brief technical notes about how the program is going to work. So please put all of your questions into the Q&A found at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to collect everybody's questions and verbally ask them of our presenters at the conclusion of their presentation. And for those of you joining us on Facebook, DCPL's Executive Director, Rebecca Miller, will be monitoring any questions that you all might have and will pass those along to me as well. So with that, I am pleased to introduce you all to today's speakers. Richard Walker is Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught from 1975 to 2012 and served as chair for 5 years. His books include 2 co-authored classics in economic geography, The Capitalist Imperative and The New Social Economy, and he's also written 4 additional books on California. Walker has received awards from the Fulbright Program, the Guggenheim Foundation, Association of American Geographers, California Studies Association, and Western History Association. And he is joined by Brent McKee, who serves as the project historian for the Living New Deal. He has done extensive research in the National Archives, which has contributed to hundreds of New Deal sites on their national map that you can find on their website. And McKee has an MA in Public History from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and an MA in History from American University. And with that, I'm so excited to turn things over to Richard and Brent.
Thank you, Melissa and Rebecca. Thank you all for being here. And thanks for inviting us. Now, I can't see, I'm seeing your screen, but not my screen.
Okay, yep. I'll stop sharing mine and then we can get yours set up.
All right, good.
Okay.
Okay, good. Well, hello, everyone. We are the Living New Deal, a group in, well, it's not just in Berkeley, California anymore. It's across the country. And we're going to talk about parks and the New Deal in Washington, D.C., based on the research that we've done to create a map of a printed map of the New Deal in Washington, D.C. See, here's an outline for our talk. And I'll just introduce briefly the Living New Deal and our city maps. And then we'll get to the DC map. And then we're going to talk in some detail about what the New Deal did for parks in the district. So now we go. All right, the Living New Deal is an organization started out here in Berkeley, but we have people across the country, including Brent, who lives up in West Virginia. We have people in New York. We have a branch in New York. We have someone in Boston and so on. And we have volunteers in all 50 states who send us information. And we've been around for about a decade as a national organization. We're a nonprofit. We started as a research project at University of California, Berkeley. We're also a nonprofit. And, you know, we've been growing steadily all these years. And what the foundation of our work is a national map of all New Deal public works sites. And that foundation allows us to offer something that nobody's ever done, which is an effort to document everything the New Deal did. And interestingly enough, that was never done. We have a very interesting website full of information, and we carry out various public educational activities to sort of educate people about what the New Deal did, and to also talk about what the New Deal, the idea, the New Deal model, New Deal ideals could mean for America today, which I will return to at the end of this talk. I won't get into our future plans here. Here's what our national map looks like online. All those tiny, teeny, tiny dots. We have mapped 16,500 sites so far, but that's actually scratching the surface. There's got to be well over 100,000 New Deal public works sites, which includes everything from giant hydroelectric dams to humble picnic grounds in local parks, playgrounds, wildlife refuges, sewer projects, road projects. Probably they did the single biggest New Deal public works was roads. So some of them are very well known, like Hoover Dam, and most of them are not known at all, and in fact have disappeared from memory, even though a majority of them are still functioning and are still out there. So our job is to try and dig these information up, document it, and then we put it on our map. And you'll see if you zero in on part of the map, you can see on the lower right, approaching the Washington area. And then on the upper left, as you get close there, you start to see there are icons which tell you what kind of project it is, whether it's infrastructure or a school or civic buildings or what. You know, we have kind of 10 big categories, and then we actually have about 60 tiny, smaller categories, because the whole system of the New Deal is so complex. Which brings me to my next point. Oh no, that's not my next point. My next point is the New Deal website. livingnewdeal.org is our URL, our address. You can find us easily on the web. You Google us and we pop right up. And this is what our website looks like. You actually scan down through these 4 categories. We're redesigning it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it here. Just to say it's chock-a-block with information, news about the New Deal, history about the New Deal. That's our most popular part, much of it written by Brent McKee here, which gets probably more hits than anything because the biggest single group of users for our website are students and teachers. It seems like, and you can see our activity on Google go up and down with the semester. So we're quite a useful resource for students, teachers, preservationists, local historians, people looking for family history, if they have family members who worked in the WPA or CCC and so on. This is our map series, which is one of the ways we reach out to people. We do talks, we do conferences, we do webinars of our own on various New Deal topics now, and so on. So one of the ways we think it's effective to get the word out to people about the New Deal who may not have heard of us or know very little, or maybe have heard of the New Deal, but have no idea how much it did, is we put out these printed maps. And we've done San Francisco, New York, and now DC, and we're working actively to get ready to do Los Angeles next. And we'd like to do all the big cities in turn. And these all look similar. The San Francisco one was first, and it's a little smaller. So I'll give you the details about the Washington, DC map. It's a big poster-sized map on high quality stock. It's very beautiful. You can use it as a poster. We have flat copies, but mostly we offer and sell for the very modest price of $5 the pocket-sized folding map, which we have many printed. And this can This can be carried with people if they're using it for a walking tour, and it's easy to show people, unfold and show people. What it has in DC, we have 500 sites, over 500 sites that Brent is chiefly responsible for coming up with, of which we feature 34, have little photographs and bigger icons on the map. And then we describe the notable sites on the back, which is very useful for people who are looking for some of the famous and larger places, whether it's the Department of Interior or the Jefferson Memorial or whatever it might be. And there's an inset of the mall. So I'll show you each of these in turn. This is what the map looks like. On the left, the map side, again, this is 18 by 27, so it's quite large. And you can see all those little dots pretty clearly. And they're color coded by function, by activity, parks, infrastructure, schools, that sort of thing. And there are those little inset photos of the bigger projects. You can see, of course, mapping DC with its funny shape leaves you a lot of space around the edges that we could use for these inset maps. And down below, you see the little inset of the mall area, which is the biggest concentration of important sites, especially sites with a federal building and city buildings with lots of artworks. On the back, we have descriptions of those major sites and a little blurbs, which looks upside down here, but when you fold it, is easily read on the New Deal, on Washington and the New Deal, and so on. And there is a little inset on the right here about the 10 major sites outside the district, but we couldn't possibly map all New Deal sites outside the district, where we still have to do lots more research. We are very research intensive on the district, less so outside, but there are some very notable sites outside, like built by the New Deal, like the National Airport or the rest of the CNO, Canal, Historical Park, or the National Institutes of Health, Walter Reed Hospital and Medical Center. Okay, this is you can see on this, on this shot of the upper map that the dots are pretty clear, and then the little inset map is here. So you can see that quite clearly. And so now we want to talk a bit about the New Deal and parks. That's our main topic for today. But anything, if you have questions about the Living New Deal, about how we go about our business, about the New Deal in general, we're more than happy to talk about that. So here's the general overview of what the New Deal did for parks in the district. It developed and improved all the large parks, Rock Creek Parkway, Rock Creek Parkway, the National Mall, Anacostia Park, and that sort of complex. It includes the Arboretum, National Arboretum, the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, and developments within Anacostia, Teddy Roosevelt Island Park, and the CNO Canal National Park. And then small parks. The New Deal improved virtually all the small parks and playgrounds across the city, school grounds, and recreation facilities were added to the small parks as they were improved, and also to school grounds throughout the city. And then there was massive effort along the river, well, both to clean up the river, which was very polluted, was kind of a cesspool at the time, the Anacostia 2, and to build marinas along the Washington Channel. We'll return to all these in more detail. And effectively, I think my view is that effectively the L'Enfant, the plans of people starting with the L'Enfant in 1790 through Grant buying the land for Rock Creek Park, through the McMillan plan with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. on that board, who planned the Parkway and so on, and TR Island Park and so on. Those plans were essentially completed by the New Deal. And along with the fact the New Deal completed Federal Triangle, Judiciary Square, and a lot of the streets and the parkways, meant that the New Deal kind of built or created the modern Washington, D.C. that tourists and citizens come to see, that they're proud of. That's the kind of monumental capital city of today, all cleaned up, spruced up, and so on. Of course, now it's all has fences around the Capitol. We will not talk about those unfortunate events today. All right. Who did this? Well, the New Deal had many agencies, and this was a joint effort of some of the most notable New Deal agencies. The Public Works Administration, which was the one that had the money to fund large public works around the country. And that one they funded the mall, finishing up Meridian Hill Park, the National Arboretum, land, purchasing more land, buying the C&O Canal from its bankrupt owners, and so on. The WPA, that was relief work. WPA, Works Progress Administration, would do small projects and hire unemployed people, by and large, mostly unemployed people, to do small projects. And they did most of the small parks, the small playgrounds, play fields, swimming pools, and so on. There's a little article there on the right from, I think it's from the Evening Star, about the number of playgrounds. It's actually 97, not 85. 97 parks and 118 playgrounds. CCC had 2 camps in the district and a couple of camps in Virginia, and they did major work on all the big parks around the cities. We'll see some pictures of that later. And there's some statistics that Brent dug up about just park work that CCC did in the district. The number of trees planted, for example. The CCC planted millions and millions of trees around the country. And that goes for the District of Columbia as well. But it's not just PWA, WPA, and CCC. They all work together. They would work under the National Park Service, which was given control of the capital parks, or it would work with the DC commissioners, that is city government, or with the capital, the national capital architect, right around Capitol Hill, on projects like building the new addition to the Library of Congress. And we've discovered, if you go on our website and you look at various projects, you'll discover that there's at least 60 or more different important New Deal programs, which we have summaries of on the website. And those show up, on many of them, in actually building public works. So it's not like antiseptically you can say, well, there was PWA or a couple of things, WPA, who built all the public works. There were line agencies around the country, like the Bureau of Reclamation, the Corps of Engineers that worked on dredging the Potomac River. But under the New Deal, that's New Deal money, just the way we would say, oh, well, that's Biden administration money. It was New Deal money. And of course, DC government has always in the past, gotten its money from the federal government. So there's just an incredible array of New Deal programs and types of projects they did. Some of that will come out in today's talk, and we are happy to say more about that. Well, this was useful just to remind us of what the New Deal was like. The New Deal didn't just build things and just didn't hire people to get through the Depression. It did a number of very important, had a number of very important principles, many of them adopted from the Progressive era, and some of them original to the New Deal era, to help Americans and improve the country. And one of the things that was extremely important at the time was the idea of developing public recreation, both for health of children, for relief from labor, the drudgery of labor, that people of all classes could get out to the national parks or just the local parks and get fresh air, go with their kids on the weekend and so on. So this was an America that wasn't as, it was very different from the 19th century and the kind of work of the early 19th century, of the factory, the big factory period. They were actually starting to think about leisure and recreation, something that of course has developed much more in our time. But this is the glory days of fans going to baseball games by the millions, when baseball was really the national pastime. And the New Deal really worked very hard to improve the recreational outlets and facilities for average Americans. And you see a quote, which you've probably been reading while I'm blabbing, and I won't read to you, by FDR about the importance of parks. And then what the New Deal did in DC, a statement in 1937 from one of the DC commissioners, which were the managers of the district. And of course, it continued doing things, started in 1933 and continued doing work until the war broke out, and really into the very earlier period of the war in 1943. So this is a nice article from the Evening Star that Brent dug up, and about how many millions, and it really was millions, spent in the district by the New Deal to build swimming pools, tennis courts, and simple playgrounds and play fields. This is just the amount of money that was spent overall in the district by the New Deal, and this was real money in the 1930s. I mean, it's a pittance today, but if you made these billions, they'd be more equivalent to what we'd spend today. And you can see it's pretty substantial. PWA spent the most because it had the deepest pockets. But WPA got in there with quite a bit of money, especially later in the decade. And then the National Youth Administration, which is part of the WPA. Nobody remembers the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, but it was very, very important in the early days of just getting out relief so people wouldn't starve, and also putting people to work. And then the Civil Works Administration, which was the predecessor of the WPA, just in the winter of 33, 34. And the New Deal was brilliant in a lot of ways, and in other ways they made mistakes. And one of the mistakes was closing down the CWA after 6 months. And they very quickly realized that it had worked brilliantly to hire, what was it, Brent? Maybe 3 million people during that winter? No, I think it was more like 5 million people.
It was like 4.2 million.
4.2,
yeah.
Okay. And of course, unemployment went back up when they stopped it. So then they created the WPA, which got underway in 35. All right. And these are just one of the brilliant things they did was to hire local unemployed, mostly locals, but also some people came in from elsewhere. And so many locals, thousands of DC residents were sent elsewhere to work, often out in Virginia and Maryland, up in the Appalachians and so on. And we see a couple of pictures, 3 pictures here of CWA and CCC workers at various sites, many of them African-American, a point we'll come back to later. All right, Brent, did you want to add anything to that? I've been hogging the stage here before I turn it over for you on the next topic.
Oh, no, I think we're ready to go to the next slide, yeah.
Okay, we're gonna now offer some of our favorite park sites and get more specific here. So Brent, take it away.
All right. Okay, so we're going to go over Folger Park, the Washington waterfront, and the National Zoo. And we can go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so up in the upper left-hand corner, you see Folger Park, and that's one of my favorite places as far as parks go in DC. Uh, First of all, because I went there on such a beautiful day, as you can see. Um, the Public Works Administration funded the redevelopment of this park, and there were private contractors who did a lot of the work, and that's how PWA worked in that fashion. A city would apply for money for some sort of project. PWA, if they approved, would send the money along, and it was usually private contractors who did the work, although sometimes it would be WPA workers. WPA may have worked in Folger Park, but it was mainly PWA funded. And it's a nice, for those who haven't been there, I'm sure a lot of you have, but to me, it's a nice little oasis from the hustle and bustle of the city life that surrounds it. So it's just a nice little green space. And when I was there, I guess 2 or 3 years ago is when I took this picture. It looks nice in the photo, but it was actually, starting to crumble apart. So I'm not sure if they've done anything to fix it up lately. But some of the artwork, there's not a lot of artwork there, but some of the artwork that was there is really faded. The water fountains weren't working at the time, which I guess is pretty typical today. The walkways, some of the walkways were sort of crumbling. It looks like someone's asking where Folger Park is. It's down close to the Library of Congress.
Yeah, it's on the backside of Capitol Hill.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, it's pretty close to the National Mall, right on the edge of it, near the Library of Congress. I think a little south of it. I forget what the metro stop is for it, but you can find it online, and it's definitely worth going to and just checking out. It's not a huge park, but it's really beautiful green space. It would be really beautiful right now, actually, if you went there. Let's see, let me go to the bottom left. That's an African-American WPA crew working at Langdon Park, which still exists today, although I don't know how much of the WPA's work still exists in that park. I'm sure it's been redeveloped a few times since. Yeah, and we'll be touching on the African-American issue a little bit later. And then in the upper right, where you see that swing set, that is Rosedale Park. And what's interesting about that is the WPA improved the park. And in the background, you'll see there's some, well, it's a little hard to see, but in the background, there's some adults and young adults and older adults. They're WPA and National Youth Administration recreation leaders. So the New Deal not only went in there and fixed up these parks and in some cases created new ones, but they also staffed them with recreation leaders to supervise the children, make sure things are safe, lead activities, try to make things a little more interesting for the kids. Then we have in the center right, that is Meridian Hill Park. Dick, you know a little bit more about that, I think, than I do. Do you want to say just a little bit about that?
Well, it was started in the teens and had been partly built, but not completed. And so PWA gave money. We don't know whether WPA workers worked there, though they likely did, because they were kind of going in all the parks. And but in any case, they finished up the park in a variety of ways. This is something I should have said before. There are many people in this audience who probably know more about some of the details of this than we do. We've tried to put this together, sometimes somebody like me at a distance. And we would love to be corrected on anything we say and anything that's on our maps, on our online map and so on. So this one was finished up, and that's often the case. Most of these parks, they were there, they had been purchased, the land was set aside, but nothing had been done, or very little had been done, or they'd fallen into decrepitude. So this is just a good example of them finishing things up and tidying them up and making it usable.
Yeah. Just to build on what Dick said, yeah, we see that a lot. I think either in a historic American building survey or in documentation at the National Register of Historic Places, it talks about how Meridian Hill had kind of just sat for a while. There were plans to fix it up, but the funds just weren't there. The New Deal came in, the funds were there. And so, yeah, we see that a lot. In the lower right-hand corner, that's a picture Dick added to just to show that Meridian Hill Park is still a vibrant place that people like to go to, obviously, because it's such a beautiful place. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is really interesting. This is the Washington Channel, part of the Washington Harbor. Some of this research we did years ago, and some of it we did just weeks ago. So it's a really interesting place. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the Arlington Bridge, of course, and in the water there, from about 1930s to 1960s, there was a barge, and for a good part of that time, there was a WPA-built band shell. So they would have symphonies right there on the water on a barge, and it was called Sunset Symphonies. And some people who've, some of the old timers of DC will probably remember that. I think it ran late 60s, early 70s, somewhere around there. And then from what I understand, the noise of the airport was just starting to get too much, so they discontinued it. But so I took that picture there, and behind me would be the steps leading up to the Lincoln Memorial direction. And today, people like exercising on those steps. They like running up and down. I get the impression it's a really popular jogging area. But the steps would go all the way down to the water. People would sit on these steps. People would come in canoes and watch the symphonies. So it's really fascinating to stand there and sort of, picture what it must have looked like back then. In the center top is the Washington Marina. This was built probably with New Deal Corps of Engineers funding. As Dick was saying, even agencies that had existed before the New Deal were enhanced with more money, more New Deal money, so they could do more. So this Washington Marina here was built with Corps of Engineers money, but probably by a private contractor. And it was part of what was called Yacht Basin Number 1. So they redid the Washington Channel. It was really run down, and they built new piers and docks for commercial activities, for steamboat excursions, for private boats to dock up. In the upper right, we have the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, which FDR was very instrumental in pushing for. He was at the laying of the cornerstone. He gave the dedication, or was part of the dedication ceremony, and he was involved in the architecture of it as well. In the lower right-hand corner is just part of the Southwest waterfront today, or in modern times, showing some commercial activities going on there, some tourist activities, looks like. In the left-hand side, you'll see that map there. And that gives you an idea of just how much New Deal activity was going on there. The Titanic Memorial was either moved or repaired by the WPA after a flood. You have East Potomac Park, which the New Deal was heavily involved in. In fact, some of the tennis courts there, the CCC first put down, although they've probably been, redone over time. There was a PWA funded, we thought it was WPA, but it's probably PWA funded pool was in East Potomac Park. It was just torn down a few years ago. You have the FDR Memorial, which is run by the National Park Service. It's not New Deal, but it's obviously relevant to the New Deal. What I mean is it wasn't built during the New Deal, of course. And so there's all sorts of stuff going on in that area by the New Deal. So that's a very rich area, and like I said, we've just been researching it lately, so it's kind of an exciting area. Okay, next slide. Okay, National Zoo. Obviously, this is probably a lot of people's favorite place, favorite park in the district. So much going on in the National Zoo. The WPA helped build exhibits, like for example, a bear exhibit. Some of those exhibits some of those original WPA exhibits might still be there, although they've been enhanced, reworked, but it does look like some of the exhibits, I've made several site visits there. It looks like several of the exhibits might be original to the WPA, but it's hard to tell for sure. In the center bottom, you have the restaurant, the zoo restaurant. That was a Public Works Administration building. There used to be a New Deal mural inside called Noah's Ark. It's not there anymore. Anyone who's been to the zoo lately knows that the interior has been, really modernized. So there's nothing on the inside that is reminiscent of the New Deal. The outside of the building, though, does look very similar. Actually, I'd say almost exactly as it did when the PWA funded it. And one of our volunteers, if you look in front of the restaurant, there's a lady with a light tan shirt on. That's one of our volunteers. Her name is Maureen Budetti. Some of you might know her. She really helped us out a lot in DC, and she was there with me that day at the zoo. So, so shout out to her. Shout out to her for helping us so much. The lower left, you see a guy named Dominic Mortalito. He was funded by the Treasury Relief Art Project, which was a Treasury program, but not Treasury Section of Fine Arts or Arts and Sculpture, but Treasury Relief Art Project funded most of the art at the zoo. Some of his art, excuse me, some of his artwork is still there, but like these murals that he did for these, I think that the mural there was for the Elephant House. They're all gone, and some of the New Deal art has just been lost at the zoo. And in fact, the mural, the Noah's Ark mural, I asked, and I could not find out, what happened to it. Did we lose it recently? Did we lose it in the 1950s? I have no idea. So, and then we have a nice sculpture relief in the upper right, also New Deal created. You'll see quite a few of these at the Elephant House, so it's kind of neat that they're still there. Okay. Oh, and the upper left is the small mammal house, I believe. Yeah, that's an anteater sculpture that it's hard to see, but it's right outside the small mammal house. So that was a New Deal funded building there.
Yeah, they did the elephant house, the small mammal house, the reptile house. Did they do reptile? No, maybe not.
I think the
They did.
reptile house is a little older.
It's older, a part of the bird house, and then the restaurant, and then a lot of those exterior enclosures. And there's still actually quite a bit of art out there. If you look on our map, you'll see that there's a good bit.
And even the CCC contributed in terms of a lot of the planting that the WPA did at the National Zoo. They received their trees and shrubs from a CCC nursery. So that's kind of a interesting side note. All right, next slide. I guess that's it for my section on there.
Okay. All right, so I'll just talk about the three areas. The mall, Rock Creek Park and Parkway, which are separate, as those of you who know parks well understand, and the whole Anacostia Park complex on the east side of the city. So the mall, had been laid out going back to the L'Enfant plan, but it had been used for all kinds of different activities, including buildings added during the Civil War, storage areas in World War I, and a bunch of that was still on it in the 1930s. So PWA laid out $1 million just for the mall, and they had in the 20s already put the reflecting pool in on the west end of the mall, between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, but the east end was still in very crude shape. So the modern look of it, with the big lawns, the wide pathways, and all the trees along there, and even the configuration of the roadways on the east end and around the Washington Monument, that was all redone by WPA, and WPA workers planted hundreds of trees. I think we have an article that says there's 3,000 elm trees still left from that planting. They moved the Botanic Gardens on Capitol Hill and tidied that up. And then they repaired the Washington Monument, which was in pretty bad shape. It had been built about 50 years earlier and had a lot of mortar coming out and leakage and so on. So you see on the lower left there, that's a picture of the scaffolding on it in the 1930s. But the Jefferson Memorial was added, as Brent said, at this time. And on the lower right, that's a picture of the Jefferson elm, which is apparently still there, I hope, given the Dutch elm devastated a lot of those. So the mall, and they added tennis courts on the side of the mall, which are now gone. So it was quite a big project. And they also put flood levees where the river and the mall intersect, and built up the levees so that parts of the mall would not flood anymore, because that was a fairly regular occurrence then. So that's part of actually the fixing up of the waterfront that Brent was talking about before. So the mall, again, is the sort of visual centerpiece of the city, of a monumental city that we all think of as Washington, D.C., as the national capital. And the New Deal did a good deal to make that into the beautiful place it is today. They also worked extensively in the large parks, in this case, Rock Creek and Rock Creek Parkway. They finished the Parkway, which had been a part of the McMillan Plan. Mostly the central portion of the Parkway around P Street, but also like this, the Shoreham Hill Bridge there that you see in the center, upper right. Upper left, they gave money, PWA gave money, or no, federal government gave money to DC commissioners to help rebuild a couple of the major bridges across Rock Creek. In this case, the Duke Ellington Calvert Street Bridge there. And there's a car alarm going off the background. I hope you all can't hear it. You can see an overview of Rock Creek Park, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, urban park in the country. And the CCC built the bridle, all the paths and trails along the creek and throughout the park, roads, part of the road system, much of the road system, picnic areas, and so on. The WPA worked on sewerage going down along the creek, some of which could use an upgrade. That apparently hasn't been, when I looked at it 3 or 4 years ago, hadn't been much been done with it, and it was leaking. And the park is obviously a beloved place, in all seasons, and much used. And again, CCC, WPA, PWA, city commissioners were all involved in the improvement and completion of the park and the Parkway, which is still remarkably beautiful all these years later, much except for the traffic. I guess it was probably very nice during the COVID epidemic year. That probably was an advantage, one of the few good things of the year past. This is on the east side, the Anacostia, what I like to call the Anacostia Park complex. There's Anacostia Park itself, and then at the north end, the Kenilworth Gardens, Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens. The National Arboretum across on the west side of Anacostia Creek, which is not actually part of Anacostia Park, as you all surely know. And, but it's very, very beautiful. And then you see in the lower left there, Langston Golf Course. So the park itself was there, but the CCC set up a camp in the park. The PWA gave money to expand, double the size of the Arboretum. CCC went in there and did all the basic land development and plantings under the supervision there of the National Park, no, of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, actually. They're plant people, because it had been their idea to have the national arboretums. So as often is the case, the CCC would work for another agency. It did Bureau of Biological Survey for wildlife refuges like Roach's Run across the river, the Potomac River, and in this case, under the Bureau of Plant Biology, the Department of Agriculture. And then the CCC improved the play areas, lawn areas, playgrounds. I think WPA came in. PWA paid money for the swimming pool in Anacostia Park at the Anacostia Swim Center, though the center itself was older. And the monument there at the Arboretum there in the center, lower center, that's not New Deal, but everybody knows it as kind of the iconic visual introduction to the Arboretum. But they did lay out much of the area, did many of the plantings and so on. Same thing with Kenilworth Gardens, the aquatic garden. CCC did the basic waterworks, the dikes and trails and roads in and so on, and then helped start the plantings that went into the aquatic gardens. So it's a very, it's a huge area. It's a huge park. It's bigger than Central Park. And what's also important about it, segue into our next topic, is that of course it's on the east side, which is the poorer side, the blacker side of Washington, D.C. at the time and today. And the New Deal did a lot of work on that side of town. So those are really magnificent examples of the parks. Now, what we wanted to do is talk a little bit here, because it's so topical in our time, with Black Lives Matter movement that broke out last year. It's been a very enlightening moment, a kind of really wake-up moment for white Americans, and a great moment for historians like us to talk about the role of African Americans in American history, and also talk about the relationship of the New Deal to African Americans. There's a lot of, as you probably know, a lot of hasty judgments, quick judgments about what is valid, what isn't in history, what is oppressive, and what is liberatory. And we can't get into all of that today, although we at the Living New Deal we're starting a project on endangered New Deal art, because one of the greatest things the New Deal did was provide probably the single biggest period of public art, creation of public art in this country's history, certainly of federally funded public art. So the African Americans benefited in DC, benefited a lot from the New Deal, from its hiring programs, from its relief programs, and from its parks programs, and even from its arts programs. So Brent is going to go through some of the details here.
Yeah, so building on what Dick said, I'm sure all of you have heard recent criticism of the New Deal, that it really was racist. It was designed for white people, and only white people benefited from it. And that it started segregation or increased segregation or what have you. So what I've noticed is that there's a lot of applying modern sensibilities backward. So we look at our sensibilities today and we apply it to the New Deal and we say, whoa, something's wrong. The New Deal must not have been good. But I think the better way to measure the New Deal is not from point C to point B, but from point A to point B. In other words, what progress was made. And a lot of the criticism the New Deal involves, well, why was it segregated? Why were so many CCC camps segregated? Why were these projects not equitable for Blacks and so forth? And what you have to remember is that America at that time basically had legal apartheid. The Plessy v. Ferguson case sanctioned apartheid and basically said, to states and localities. If you want to separate facilities, you have every right to do that. It wasn't until after the New Deal, and especially with Brown versus Board and related decisions, that this idea of segregation being wrong. So the New Deal really could not stop segregation. Segregation was constitutional by the Plessy v. Ferguson case. That was still the law of the land. Now, so what I like to say is that the New Deal did an awful lot within the confines of segregation. And so
You
I
should
just wanted,
add,
oh
Brent,
yeah,
could I interrupt?
sure, sure.
At Woodrow Wilson, an earlier form of a Democrat was had resegregated Washington, D.C. for federal facilities in Washington, D.C. So D.C. was a Jim Crow southern city at the time.
Right. So just a few of the sites in DC that we want to point out is the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. You can go there and you can get tours of the house. It's about a 10 to 15 acre sized park. It's really nice. I went there and it's a great place to go. They show a nice film of Frederick Douglass's life, and it's really beautiful grounds. The New Deal was instrumental in preserving the Frederick Douglass site. It had really struggled for a long time until, again, New Deal funds came in. Okay, here we have the slide of the Frederick Douglass house there. The lady on the upper right is a WPA worker. WPA workers went in there and organized records, displayed artifacts, and did your basic museum type work to get this off the ground. And of course, there were many other people who made the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site possible. There were people long before the New Deal who put in a lot of work towards it. But it was really the New Deal that came in and just put the money in it. In the lower right, that's not at the Frederick Douglass site, but it's just it's a picture of National Youth Administration workers getting carpentry training through the National Youth Administration. And the National Youth Administration did much of the groundwork for the Frederick Douglass Historic Site. So a lot of New Deal work going on there. All right, next slide. Okay, this is Langston Golf Course. I believe it's the first African-American golf course in DC. It might have been second, but I think it was first.
It was the second that was legally open, but it was really the one that African Americans had lobbied for years and really wanted.
Right. So this is symbolic of something that happened all across the country. It was increasing recreation sites for African Americans. Sometimes it could be at integrated sites if the community was into integration. But in some areas where segregation was how things were, it had to be separate. Okay, so a lot of times when you hear all the New Deal was racist, it's because the locality where the project was funded had that culture. And the New Deal could not come in and say, oh, well, you must integrate, because again, they had the constitutional right to do what they were doing, even though as we look back today, it doesn't look good, obviously. One of the recent photos we found was on the left-hand side, that's Joe Louis, the heavyweight boxer at Langston Golf Course. So that's from the Evening Star. The Evening Star newspaper archives was really helpful for us as we were collecting sites and gathering data. All right, next slide. Okay, the C&O Canal. This one, I really haven't looked into it a lot. But as you can see, there were African-American CCC workers there working on some of the locks. A lot of what they did was, well, I shouldn't say a lot of what they did, but one of the things they did was cleaned up a lot of trash that was in the canal, just basic cleanup of pollution. And when I went to the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, where I went was at the where that big General Services Administration power plant is. I forget what the name of it is. Big, huge building. But guess what was in the areas? Bottles and trash. And I was thinking, well, we need another CCC today to clean it up again. But a lot of what they did I'm not sure if the WPA was involved. I think it was mainly CCC and PWA funds.
And the National Park Service.
Right.
Yeah.
So they cleaned it up. They restored some of the historic locks and put it in better shape.
Yeah, they actually they ran steamboats on it again, which hadn't happened for years. I don't know if you can even do that now because things have deteriorated again. But yeah, they took over. The government bought the C&O Canal and created all the way up to, I think it's to Potomac, Maryland, was turned into the National Historic Park. And CCC guys are the ones who, turned the towpath and the canal into something, a recreational space.
Yeah, I think the whole Parkway, the C&O Canal Parkway, is about 185 miles, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And actually the uppermost portion of it is not far from where I live. The uppermost portion, I believe, is in Cumberland, Maryland. And I don't live too far from there.
Yeah, I think
in
the
West
CCC worked on about the first 30 miles up from Georgetown.
Yeah.
And part of it's in the district. So that's why I included. Part of it's obviously far beyond.
Right. All right, next slide. Oh, so here we have Howard University. Not technically a park, but I'm sure, I don't know if the New Deal did any of the recreation, like working on athletic fields or not.
Well, they did landscaping.
Landscaping. But this is just an example, again, of showing how the New Deal, even in areas that were either institutionally segregated or culturally segregated or both, they did stuff for African Americans, like Howard University. And they built educational facilities, both college and K through 12, all across the country. So again, they couldn't always end segregation, but they could enhance the facilities that African Americans used. And FDR gave a dedication speech to one of these buildings. I think the chemistry building, I can't remember.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's where he said that line, we're not going to have any forgotten races or something like that. So he was trying to enhance educational opportunities for African Americans, and not just FDR, but the New Deal generally. There were other New Dealers who were more aggressive in helping African Americans than FDR was, such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior and the head of the PWA. So I feel that FDR did do a lot for African Americans, but there were New Dealers who were much more proactive. So, okay, next slide.
And the PWAs who gave the money to Howard. They built four buildings, redid the landscaping. I kind of like to think of it as a park because, professional class white people like me grew up going to universities that had these beautiful campuses. And so that sort of college campus experience in a park-like setting is very much a part of the American upper class and white experience. And it is for some Black people, but this was, kind of a very important site, has been an incredibly important site and space within DC for African Americans.
Okay, and this is the Mary McLeod Bethune, if I'm pronouncing her name right, memorial. And she was an important New Dealer. She was an administrator in the National Youth Administration, and she was part of the Black Cabinet, and she had the ear of FDR, and she especially had the ear of Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was able to make sure that the National Youth Administration really provided a lot of opportunities for African Americans. And where the CCC somewhat failed, not totally, but somewhat failed to give equal opportunity to African Americans, the National Youth Administration certainly did. Recently, we came across an article where the NAACP had written to Congress saying, please keep the CCC and National Youth Administration because it has been very valuable for young African Americans. So whenever you hear people say, oh, well, the CCC was just completely segregated and African Americans couldn't participate, that's not true. But they weren't as equitable as the National Youth Administration was. So anyway, this is a really nice site. It wasn't created during the New Deal, but after the New Deal to memorialize Miss Bethune. So it's a nice park across, probably most of you already know this, but across in the same park, but across the way, there's that famous statue of Abraham Lincoln, and there's a slave who's kneeling before him with some broken chains. And I think the symbolism is, that Abraham Lincoln helped break the chains of slavery. I think that's what that statue is symbolic of, although I don't know a lot about it. But this is in the same park there, of course.
Yeah, and that one's been, that other one has got a lot of controversy. This one, not so much.
Right. All right, next slide. I think
I think that's it.
Yeah, right.
So
Okay, yeah.
I thought we might wrap up here because the New Deal is very much in the air. There's just articles all the time comparing Biden to FDR, or is Biden going to be FDR? Is this a New Deal? The Green New Deal, of course, gets a lot of attention from progressive forces and so on. So the question is, I think we're in a position to say something intelligent about is how valid those comparisons are. Now, again, this takes me away from parks, but I think people are very much alert to these questions right now. So I'll just finish up on this and then we can open up for questions. I do think they're very similar in some ways. That is, you come in at a moment of really deep national crisis, economic, as well as social inequality had been massive in the 1920s. The economy had collapsed under Hoover, and massive numbers of people unemployed. It was perhaps more evenly distributed in a way in the Great Depression, which was a longer collapse. The economy had collapsed for 4 years by the time FDR came in 1933, whereas we had this, deep and sudden collapse in 2020 that we're now pulling out of. But there's much more to it than that, which is the problems of not just the economy, but inequality and democracy, and kind of fraying of the social fabric. People don't remember that in 1933, there was a revived fascist movement in America, very strong populist movements on the left and right of FDR. And FDR, rallied people around American democracy and that liberalism could solve the country's problems. And that's the kind of thing Biden is saying. And I think they share that deep dedication to the democratic project and to also a concern for the common people. There are a lot of indices like the stock market that make it sound like the economy today is doing great. And if you're rich, you got richer in 2020. But if you're poor, the chances of being unemployed were very, very high. And the chances of losing your apartment and going hungry are extremely high. And Biden seems to understand that. So those guys, they're funny because they're both middle of the road. FDR gets lionized, and we do some of that too, but after the New Deal, he was so brilliant and so wonderful. Well, he was a politician, and he was a good one, a brilliant one, and he was a decent man, and he cared for the country and so on, but he made his calculations based on politics. Well, Biden is the same kind of guy from a somewhat middle of the road position, but circumstances forcing them both to do much more than you would have expected and to be even better presidents than they might have been. So the bold moves are important. And it's funny, Biden just quotes the other day about, I'm not going to run deficits. Well, he is going to run deficits. And they aren't just all to be blamed on the Republican tax cuts, though a lot of them are. But that's fine, because in fact, running deficits is something the federal government can do, especially and has to do when the economy's in the dumps. And that was what was learned in the 1930s for the first time. And FDR was he kept saying, I've got to balance the budget. But in fact, his policies were the first to break with that orthodoxy in peacetime ever. And when he tried to go back to balancing the budget in 37, 38, then he helped create a deep recession, a sudden short 1-year recession. And then they turned the faucet back on at federal spending, federal programs. WPA got bigger than ever, and the economy took off again. It is, by the way, there's an idea that the New Deal was only temporary relief and didn't do anything more important. But in fact, and that World War II is responsible for solving the Great Depression. In fact, from the moment FDR came in, the economy started to grow and grew over the next decade at an average rate of 8%, which is before the World War II, probably the highest sustained growth rate in American history. The infrastructure, well, that's the next big package that Biden is talking about. And they share this in that the New Deal put a great deal of emphasis on infrastructure, but they called it public works. And it had a lot of that basic stuff, roads and waterworks, parks, school buildings, and so on. But it also was much like what Biden's family care package, which is his next one in the pipeline after the infrastructure, which is what the New Deal called service project, and where they did work on, well, it was partly the service, partly the public works. They would add on to schools, they would build clinics, they would send healthcare workers out to rural areas, they would send teachers' aides out. They started food stamps and school lunch programs under the WPA were started in the New Deal. So it was much more than just boring public works. It was also social care projects. And they were about equivalent in size when you add them all up. Something Biden has not talked about so much, but could be part of his climate core proposal, is doing something like what the CCC and the WPA did, which was these small works. Plant trees here, do erosion projects there, help build an aquatic park over there. And the New Deal really walked on two legs. It wasn't just big stuff. It was lots of small stuff, which the locals wanted. And this is very important, a part of the success in the New Deal, is they went to local governments and they said, what do you want to build? And those would be submitted to the WPA. Or they'd ask the Forest Service, what do you want to do? And the CCC would do it for them. So it could be federal agencies, state governments, local city governments would say, well, we want a school gymnasium, we want a golf course, we want a swimming pool, we want our park fixed up. And the WPA would vet those projects, the PWA, and then would fund them and build them. And that meant that the local governments would pay part of it. And that meant they had buy-in, which is very important to the political success of the New Deal. And also that this was done in every county, every territory, state and territory of the country at the time. So the New Deal spread out throughout rural America. And that's something that the Biden people are talking about, and hidden in their programs is a lot for rural America, which is exactly what we need to do. Of course, we need to work in the poor parts of cities, but rural America really has declined and needs a lot of help. And that's part of the foundation for the right-wing kind of populist support for the Republicans today. And Biden talks a lot about technology, and the New Deal did a lot of modernization. So whereas Biden wants to expand the infrastructure of the internet, the New Deal expanded the infrastructure of electricity and kind of brought the country into the 20th century, whereas Biden talks about wanting to bring it into the 21st century, and so on. And the conservation programs, New Deal was very green. and was dealing with very deep problems of the destruction of American forests, farmland, waterways, and so on, that is in many ways comparable to the sort of climate crisis of today. So on that note, because I see that Melissa has reappeared
I've
on the
appeared.
screen, which makes me feel that I better stop talking. Anyway, thank you very much, and we'll be happy to entertain questions now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was really wonderful. Yeah, we have a couple of minutes, so we do have one question. We have a question from Rob. They ask, what's the percentage of the overall government budget for the New Deals, and how much did the public parks and recreation programs take? You know that.
I can answer part of that.
Mhm.
You want me to go ahead, Dick?
No, you take it.
Okay, so a good portion of that question I'd have to do research on, and probably I would assume Dick would say the same thing. But when you're talking about what percentage went to parks and recreation, I can at least give you a general idea based on a graphic that we have recently looked at and talked about. So there's a WPA graphic. It's like a pie chart, and it shows where every WPA dollar went. So let me just tell you the first few and you'll get it. So it goes in descending order. Okay, so every 38 cents or 38 cents of every WPA dollar went to roads. As Dick talked about earlier, that was their bread and butter. So 38 cents of every dollar went to roads, 11 cents to public buildings, 11 cents to recreational facilities, which would be parks, pools, any kind of thing like that. So it was number 3. And then it goes on to talk about white collar projects, utilities, sewing room projects, conservation activities like out in the forest, airports, health and sanitation. So recreational facilities was a higher priority than airports and health and sanitation for the WPA. So I think hopefully that at least answers sort of the gist of your question, is that it was actually pretty high priority. And when I saw this, it kind of shocked me. I wouldn't think recreation would be quite that high. So hopefully that helps answer a little
Well,
bit.
and also if you think of it, kind of public lands and conservation in general, then it was even higher.
Right.
Because you had these very big branches of the federal government, the Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, Soil Conservation Service. These were huge programs to purchase, cut over timber, turn it into national forests and replant it, purchase worn out farmland and turn it into biological reserves and so on. So overall, it was very, very large. And the dams, think of the dams. Now, today, the dams are not something of, I mean, I'm a long-time environmental activist, and, you know, I started as a young man with a critique of the overbuilding of dams. And much of that was done by the New Deal. So it isn't just on race that we can do retrospective criticism of the New Deal, but that's what the country wanted at the time. That's what the New Deal provided the money and urgency to do. And that's where we got Grand Coulee Dam. Now, if you're from the West, the dams loom very large in your vision of the New Deal. And it's a lot of money. That was billions of dollars.
Yeah, we have another question from Kenneth. Based on your research, how did New Deal spending in DC compare to other locations? Did the New Deal spend more money on parks in the district than other places?
We had a similar question the last presentation. And I think we kind of concluded that it's too soon for us to say whether it was lower, higher, or about the same. That's a tough question.
Yeah. I mean,
an important question, but tough one.
Yeah, it is. And we do know quite a bit about New York, San Francisco, and LA that we've done a lot of research on. And, you know, New York and LA probably are more, because the district is, you know, is not one of America's biggest cities at the time. Washington, D.C. now is in the top 10 overall. So New York and LA clearly got more. But for other major cities at the time, like Cleveland or Detroit, I would think DC probably got more than those because it's the national capital. And
Yeah.
that was really important.
Yeah, and one thing that DC might have going for it, if we were to say it was one of the top spots, is that it had a lot of district projects for DC, and there's a lot of federal facilities in that area, so that boosted spending. So
Oh, that's interesting. Great. Yeah, and then Sally asked, if you all know this answer, how was the New Deal involved in the 1909 Taft Bridge? She lives near it. She lives near it and walks over it constantly, so it's interesting to her. So, did the New Deal have any influence on that bridge?
what was the name of the bridge again?
It's the Taft Bridge. It's like in the Woodley Park area.
I haven't run across anything about them
No, I don't think
improving it.
Okay.
They could have possibly, improved it in some way. Of course, they didn't build it, of course, because that predated the New Deal, but I haven't run across anything. Yeah.
And then just a comment from Isabel to Brent. She said to watch the 1958 movie Houseboat to see the concert barge on the river and at the base of the Lincoln Memorial steps. So Houseboat.
Wow, the movie's
1958.
called, is it like a documentary or a movie?
She doesn't mention it. I don't know if Isabel, if you want to put it in the chat to clarify.
So it's 1958 and it's called Houseboat.
Yeah, Houseboat.
Oh, I'll definitely check that out.
Yeah, it'd be cool to see the concert in action.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we find out with things like that, this is we don't want to present this as, we did this map and this is the definitive work. We've done the definitive work on the New Deal. This project has been 10 years of endless discovery. And I thought I knew a bit about the New Deal. My parents were old New Dealers. My dad worked for the New Deal, his first job. And I thought, I was pretty well educated about it. It is amazing how deep you can dive. And we have immense resources that we've uncovered of reports here, there, and all over the country. Local things that people have done, local researchers have done, or things in the National Archive, photographs, thousands and thousands of photographs, tens of thousands of WPA work cards that we have not begun to scratch down through the surface. And because we're a small project that runs on 100,000 a year or something, and a lot of volunteer labor, we can't do it all. And anybody who wants to help out is interested, even locally. Don't think we did it. There is plenty to be done everywhere you live. Anyone lives around the United States, and we're always looking for volunteers to submit information and correct us, upgrade what we've got, and we'll do our best to try to keep up with you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'll read off one more question, and then for another question, I'll take the names from folks and your emails, and I'll make a note and pass them along to Richard and Brent, because we are kind of running a little bit late, but there is one question from Facebook. They are curious to hear more about the popular reception to and understanding of the New Deal throughout the following decades. Have there been certain time periods in American history that have shown more or less interest in the work from the New Deal? And do you have a sense of how the popularity or interest in the New Deal has changed? This is a loaded question. It's a pretty good one.
I think that's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
The New Deal after World War II was still popular in the popular imagination. There were a lot of people who had been saved by, from destitution by it, or their uncle and aunt or parents or grandparents. And that lasted for a long time. And it, now somebody like me is the child of the post-war.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really drummed into my head that how great the New Deal was, But that faded. It faded for a variety of reasons, but particularly it faded because A, people got older, and B, after the 60s and the recessions of the deep recessions of the 70s, there was a major turning point in American politics, which was the arrival of Ronald Reagan and of what we now call neoliberalism. But basically, America, and it was quite popular with Reagan, the idea that somehow the federal government was too big, government was the problem, and that the private market, privatization was the savior. And that had been the American view in much of American history. And the New Deal came along and changed that dramatically and told people, the federal government really should be helping you. And then that gets forgotten. And this is what happens with political revolutions anywhere, is that after a generation or two, people forget the good they did, new problems arise, and a whole new solution came into being, one which I don't agree with, but was quite popular in the 80s, and even the Democrats fell in line with it for years, until, in the 2000s, things started to go sour. You had the major blowups of the economy, and especially in 2008. It was the worst, but you got worse and worse recessions. We never really pulled out of the recession of 2008 to 12, the Great Recession. The Democrats under Obama didn't really do much for the people, and what they did try to do was blocked. So in the end, people became very angry about the failures of the government. And so we're now at another inflection point where I think Americans look around and say, my God, if you have an epidemic, economic collapse, financial, vast inequality, who's going to help you? And really the only body with the power to help you is the federal government. That doesn't mean local initiatives aren't important or state initiatives. Of course they are. But in certain things, there's no replacement for the federal government. And that's what the Biden administration is responding to. And we see that it's quite popular, not with the Republicans, but with a lot of their base, actually. It's quite popular. So this is just an amazing moment that we're living through. And it's always hard to see it when you're living through it. But I think it's going to prove to be as important as the New Deal movement when we're done with it.
Well, great. Okay, so I think we're going to have to kind of end it here, but thank you both so much for sharing more about this very exciting project with our audience today. I started talking to you, Richard, a year ago about this, so we're so happy that we were able to finally have a program to share this. I did put a link to the Living New Deal website in the chat, as well as a link to the map and your social media handle. The Living New Deal is on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I believe. So you can follow them, and we highly encourage you to check out more about the map for DC and to get yourself a copy. The weather's getting nice, so I think it'll be a nice thing to kind of take with you as you go for your walks. And before we officially get done, I just want to remind everybody to be on the lookout for future DCPL events. As you all may know, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and so each month we're going to highlight a different theme, and this month's theme is Parks and Gardens. So next week, we actually have a program to do a virtual tour of Meridian Hill Park, also known as Malcolm X Park, with author and licensed tour guide Fiona Clem. So that's taking place next Thursday at noon, and we hope you will visit our website to learn more and to register today for that. And with that, I think we got a question in the chat about where to get the map.
It's on our website. You can get it for $5. And we have somebody in DC who will mail it to you. It'll be there in a day.
Yes, there you go. So yeah, the link is in the chat again, and we'll stick around for a couple minutes, and you guys can look through the chat if you need to. So anyway, yeah, with that, thank you both again so much. Thank you again to our sponsors and to our program partners. We hope you all enjoy the nice weather today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Okay, thanks, Melissa.
Thank you both.
Thank you.